The shift that was divinely orchestrated begins with the truth your spirit already sensed before your mind could explain it. This message did not find you by accident. It was divinely aligned, positioned in your path at the exact moment your inner world reached readiness. Something irreversible is shifting inside you. Not loud, not chaotic, but deep and decisive, like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of your identity. You're not just changing habits or improving behaviors. You're becoming who heaven always knew you to be, stepping into an identity that existed in blueprint form long before your fears tried to shrink it. This is identity-level transformation, not surface improvement, not cosmetic motivation, but structural reconstruction of who you believe yourself to be. Before we go further, seal this moment intentionally. Like this message as a declaration that you recognize the shift. Share it as alignment with others whose spirits are rising. Subscribe not as routine engagement, but as agreement with your next level. And comment 77 as a sacred signal of readiness for elevation, because that number represents completion, meeting manifestation heaven, meeting earth, the unseen crossing into the seen. Only those whose spirits have already moved ahead will fully receive this word. If something inside you tightened with recognition as you read this, if your chest felt heavier or lighter, at the same time, if your intuition whispered this is for you, then you're not here casually. You're here because the shift has already begun and your understanding is catching up to what your spirit has already stepped into. The sacred dissolving of your old identity unfolds not as destruction but as refinement, and you've been feeling it quietly for weeks or perhaps months now. You wake up and something feels unfamiliar, not in your environment but in yourself. You feel detached from who you used to be. The jokes you once laughed at feel forced. The conversations you once entertained feel shallow. The environments you once tolerated now feel suffocating, like staying too long in a room without air. Old interests no longer spark excitement. Old ambitions no longer ignite urgency. Even your own reactions surprise you because you're no longer responding the way you once did. You might have questioned yourself, wondering if you were becoming cold, inconsistent, or ungrateful. But this is not depression. It is not confusion. It is not instability. It is rebirth unfolding beneath layers of familiarity. Familiarity is not alignment. Just because something feels known does not mean it is meant to continue. The survival version of you was built for a different season, a season shaped by uncertainty, by protection, by instinct. That version of you learned how to read rooms quickly, how to adjust your tone to keep peace, how to shrink brilliance to avoid intimidation, and how to over-explain boundaries to avoid conflict. That version protected you. It carried you through storms. It helped you endure environments where authenticity was unsafe. But the survival version cannot enter the abundance chapter because abundance requires presence rather than protection. Abundance requires clarity rather than camouflage. You're shedding emotional armor that once kept you safe but now keeps you restricted. You're removing masks you wore to be accepted, masks of people-pleasing, of hyper-independence, of silent endurance. You're realizing that strength does not require silence anymore. You're realizing that worth does not require performance. And as these realizations settle in, isolation may have followed. Friendship shifted, invitations decreased, conversations felt distant. You may have interpreted this as rejection at first, but isolation is not punishment. It is preparation. When a seed is planted, it disappears beneath soil before it rises. When a caterpillar enters the cocoon, it separates from what it once crawled on before it flies. Your in-between space, the space where you no longer resonate with your old life but have not fully stepped into your new one, is sacred transition. It is uncomfortable because it stretches you between identities. You may feel lonely because your vibration no longer matches your previous circle. You may feel misunderstood because you're speaking a new spiritual language not everyone has learned. But this shedding is proof of elevation. You're losing what cannot follow you into your next dimension. You're releasing attachments that anchored you to smaller narratives. And while it feels like loss on the surface, it is expansion at the core. The old identity dissolving is not evidence of breakdown, it is evidence of breakthrough. The parts of you that tolerated dishonor no longer negotiate. The parts of you that settled for half clarity now demand truth. The parts of you that feared abandonment now choose alignment over approval. This sacred dissolving is not chaotic, it is intentional, and the more you resist it, the more tension you feel. The more you surrender to it, the lighter your spirit becomes. The invisible internal rearrangement explains why nothing dramatic may have happened externally, yet everything feels different internally. Transformation begins in the unseen realm long before physical evidence appears. Before doors open, your perception shifts. Before opportunities expand, your self-concept deepens. Your inner world is being reshaped before external results appear. You may look around and see the same environment, the same job, the same people, yet you feel like you're standing in a different dimension. Your awareness has heightened. You sense energy more precisely. You notice subtleties in tone, intention, and atmosphere you once overlooked. This heightened awareness is not weakness. It is spiritual sensitivity activating. You feel clarity increasing without logical explanation. Decisions that once required overthinking now feel obvious. Situations that once confused you now seem transparent. You're seeing patterns rather than isolated events. You're connecting dots rather than reacting emotionally. This clarity did not come from overanalyzing, it came from alignment. Your desires are maturing, you no longer crave applause, you crave authenticity. You no longer chase noise, you seek peace. You no longer want attention, you want intention. This shift may feel strange because what once motivated you no longer holds power. The need to impress fades, the urgency to prove dissolves, comparison loses its grip. Your values are reorganizing around depth rather than display. You choose conversations that carry meaning rather than drama. You choose relationships that nourish rather than deplete. You choose projects that align rather than simply pay. This is not loss of ambition, it is refinement of ambition. Motivation shifts from ego to divine assignment. Instead of asking, how can I be seen, you ask, how can I be aligned? Instead of chasing what looks impressive, you move toward what feels purposeful. You're not losing passion, you're being redirected. Redirection can feel like emptiness at first because the old fuel source is gone. Ego-driven excitement burns fast and loud. Purpose-driven momentum builds steady and quiet. You may feel like you're slowing down, but you're actually stabilizing. Your nervous system is learning to operate without adrenaline. Your spirit is learning to move without panic. This internal rearrangement is preparing you for sustainability. The version of you that thrived on urgency cannot maintain long-term clarity. So heaven reshapes you inwardly before promoting you outwardly. You're being trained to handle abundance without self-sabotage. You're being trained to handle visibility without losing humility. You're being trained to handle leadership without losing compassion. This invisible work matters more than visible success. Because when the external shifts finally occur, when opportunities expand, when connections align, when doors open, you will not crumble under their weight. You will stand steady because your foundation was rebuilt first. And this is why everything feels different, even if nothing looks different yet. Your internal rearrangement is evidence that destiny is near. Your spirit has moved ahead. Your body and environment are catching up. Trust this process. Trust the discomfort. Trust the shedding. Trust the silence. Because you're not falling apart. You're being rebuilt from the inside out. The awakening of your spiritual gifts is not a dramatic explosion of supernatural spectacle, but a quiet, undeniable sharpening of your inner world, and you have already begun to notice it in subtle ways that feel almost too natural to question yet too precise to ignore. Your intuition is becoming louder than your doubts. Where you once second-guessed yourself, replaying conversations in your mind, seeking reassurance from others, now there is a steady inner knowing that arrives before logic assembles its case. You feel answers rise within you without external validation. You sense when to move and when to pause without needing permission. This is not impulsivity, it is alignment. Discernment is cutting through masks and illusions with surgical clarity. You no longer struggle to decode mixed signals. You no longer overlook red flags out of hope or fear. You read tone beneath words, intention beneath gestures, energy beneath smiles. It does not feel dramatic. It feels calm and exact. Emotional sensitivity, which you once tried to suppress because it made you feel vulnerable, is transforming into spiritual intelligence. You realize now that your sensitivity was never weakness. It was perception. You could feel shifts in rooms long before anyone acknowledged them. You could detect sincerity and deception without visible evidence. But before that, awareness overwhelmed you because it was not anchored in confidence. Now it is grounded. You can feel deeply without being destabilized. You can observe emotion without absorbing it. Your dreams are shifting as well. They're no longer random fragments of the day. They carry symbolism-layered meaning impressions that linger long after waking. You may see patterns, numbers, recurring themes, unfamiliar landscapes that feel strangely familiar. Sometimes you wake with clarity about a decision you struggled with the night before. Sometimes you wake with warning or confirmation that later manifests in subtle ways. Dreams are becoming communication rather than noise. You sense energy shifts before physical manifestation. You feel when something is about to change before circumstances reveal it. You can sense when a door is closing before it visibly shuts. You can sense when someone is withdrawing before they speak. You can sense when opportunity is approaching before it arrives. This heightened perception is not imagination, it is activation. Ancestral gifts and dormant abilities are awakening not as fantasy but as capacity. You may find yourself speaking with greater authority than before, creating with deeper insight than before, counseling others with wisdom that surprises even you. You may feel drawn to certain forms of study, certain spiritual disciplines, certain practices that once seemed distant. These inclinations are not random. They are memory surfacing as readiness. You're becoming spiritually alert and divinely connected, not in a dramatic performative way, but in a grounded, integrated way. You're less reactive, you're more observant, you're less anxious, you're more aware. You begin to realize that your inner world is not chaotic but calibrated. Your inner world becomes a divine instrument, tuned not by fear but by frequency. When you sit in silence, you do not feel empty. You feel guided. When you pray or reflect, you do not feel desperate. You feel aligned. When you make decisions, you do not feel pressured. You feel led. This awakening does not remove challenge from your life. It changes how you navigate it. Instead of reacting from trauma, you respond from awareness. Instead of chasing reassurance, you consult your spirit. Instead of asking who will approve, you ask what aligns. And as this awakening stabilizes, something else becomes inevitable, because when identity shifts and gifts activate, your environment cannot remain the same. The necessary separation unfolds not as punishment, but as consequence of growth. When identity shifts, your environment must shift, because the field around you reflects the frequency within you. Not everyone can accompany you into your next level. This is not cruelty, it is compatibility. Relationships lacking depth begin to dissolve quietly at first. Conversations feel repetitive. Shared interests fade. Emotional reciprocity feels imbalanced. You notice yourself leaving interactions drained rather than energized. You notice silence stretching between you and people you once felt close to. This is not sudden hostility, it is divergence. Old cycles of people pleasing and self-dimming break as you recognize how often you shrank to maintain connection. You realize how frequently you over-explain to avoid being misunderstood. You realize how often you compromise clarity to preserve comfort. That pattern begins to feel unnatural. Growth exposes misalignment. The more confident you become, the more obvious certain dynamics appear. Some people respond to your clarity with support. Others respond with subtle resistance. They may joke about your change. They may imply you have become distant. They may attempt to pull you back into familiar roles that no longer fit. But your spirit no longer negotiates alignment for approval. Loneliness may surface during this separation. You may feel the ache of distance from what once felt like home. But loneliness in this season is divine refinement, not rejection. Refinement removes what dilutes strength. It clears space for alignment that matches your current frequency. God removes what cannot carry your destiny, not because those people are evil, but because they are incompatible with your next assignment. Elevation narrows your path. The higher you rise, the fewer distractions you can afford. Your circle may shrink, but your clarity expands. Your calendar may quiet, but your focus sharpens. You begin to value quality over quantity in every area of your life. You recognize that access to you is sacred. You recognize that your energy is finite. You become protective not out of fear but out of stewardship. And in this narrowing you discover something profound. The fewer voices around you, the clearer your own becomes. The less noise you tolerate, the more peace you cultivate. The less you chase inclusion, the more you embody belonging within yourself. Separation is not about isolation forever. It is about recalibration. It is about releasing what anchored you to outdated narratives so that new connections, aligned connections, purposeful connections can enter without distortion. You're not losing people. You're losing versions of yourself that required those dynamics to survive. You're not abandoning community. You're refining compatibility. And as you stand in this quieter, narrower, clearer path, you realize that awakening and separation are not separate chapters, but synchronized movements of the same transformation. Your gifts sharpened so you could discern misalignment. Your identity strengthened so you could withstand distance. Your clarity deepened so you could choose alignment over familiarity. And though this season may feel intense, it is precise. You're not being stripped randomly. You're being positioned intentionally. The path ahead requires stability. The destiny ahead requires discernment. The calling ahead requires inner authority. And everything being removed is simply making space for what can truly walk beside you without shrinking who you are becoming. Seeing yourself through heaven's perspective begins the moment you realize that the most dramatic transformation is not happening around you, but within the lens through which you see yourself. And this shift in perception quietly alters everything. Your perception of yourself is transforming in ways that feel both gentle and revolutionary. You're no longer measuring your worth by reaction, applause, or inclusion. You begin to see your value independent of validation, and that independence feels unfamiliar at first because you are conditioned to gauge significance through feedback. There were seasons when a compliment lifted you and criticism crushed you, and silence from others felt like rejection and attention felt like proof of importance. But something has recalibrated. You no longer crave constant reassurance because you are developing internal confirmation. Strength forged through storms becomes visible to you in ways it never was before. You look back at chapters you once labeled as failures, and you now see endurance. You look back at heartbreak and you see depth. You look back at isolation and you see resilience. The narrative you carried about yourself begins to soften and reorganize. Your sensitivity, once treated as a flaw by environments that misunderstood you, is revealed as a gift. You recognize that your ability to feel deeply allowed you to perceive deeply. Your capacity to empathize allowed you to lead with compassion. Your awareness of subtle emotional shifts made you intuitive long before you called it that. What you once tried to suppress you now steward with confidence. You recognize your uniqueness as divine design rather than social inconvenience. The parts of you that never fully fit in the parts that thought differently, felt differently, processed differently, were not mistakes. They were markers. You stop shrinking to accommodate others because you understand now that shrinking never secured authentic connection, it only secured temporary comfort. You no longer dim your insight to avoid intimidating others. You no longer soften your boundaries to avoid discomfort. You no longer apologize for clarity. Confidence emerges not as arrogance, but as clarity. There is no need to inflate yourself when you are secure in your design. Clarity eliminates comparison. Clarity eliminates over-explanation. Clarity stabilizes posture, tone, and expectation. Your self-perception shift realigns posture in literal and symbolic ways. You walk differently because you're no longer carrying internal doubt like invisible weight. You speak differently because your words now originate from conviction rather than defense. You expect differently because you understand what you bring into every room. You no longer enter spaces asking if you belong. You enter spaces aware of what you contribute. This transformation in self-perception does not make you rigid. It makes you rooted. And when you are rooted, you cannot be easily shaken by opinions or trends. You're seeing yourself through heaven's perspective, not as flawed and scrambling, but as chosen and intentional. And as this perception stabilizes, you find yourself stepping into something even more profound. Because when you finally see yourself clearly, you begin crossing into a version of yourself you have never fully embodied before. Crossing the spiritual threshold is not an event marked by spectacle, but a moment of internal crossing where you realize you're no longer standing in the same identity you once occupied. You're stepping into a version of yourself you have never met yet strangely recognize. This is not falling apart even if it feels unfamiliar. It is becoming. The discomfort you sometimes feel is expansion, not instability. You're stretching into capacity. You begin acting with courage and intentional wisdom rather than reactive emotion. Decisions that once felt intimidating now feel manageable. Conversations that once would have triggered fear now feel navigable. You're not fearless, you're anchored. Your voice carries authority rooted in revelation rather than repetition. When you speak, you're no longer searching for agreement. You're articulating truth. There is weight in your words not because you force it, but because you believe what you're saying. You love from overflow rather than emptiness. You're no longer loving to be filled. You're loving because you are filled. This changes everything about your relationships. You do not cling. You do not beg. You do not tolerate misalignment out of fear of abandonment. You choose connection from abundance rather than desperation. You create from divine inspiration, not competition. The need to compare your timeline, your achievements, your visibility to others fades because your inspiration now comes from within. You're not reacting to what others are doing. You're responding to what you're called to do. You move with heaven's rhythm instead of ego's urgency. There was a time when you felt pressure to hurry, to achieve quickly, to prove momentum. Now you understand pacing. You understand timing. You understand that what is meant for you does not require frantic chasing. Your future self is pulling you forward. You feel it in subtle impulses to step out of comfort. You feel it in quiet nudges to trust your instincts. You feel it in the way certain opportunities suddenly feel aligned rather than intimidating. This threshold crossing does not remove all uncertainty. It reframes it. Instead of fearing the unknown, you feel curiosity about it. Instead of resisting change, you feel readiness for it. You begin to realize that the version of you shaped by survival is no longer steering. The version shaped by purpose is emerging. And as you step further into this embodiment, something else becomes clear. None of this happened randomly. None of this awakening separation perception shift or threshold crossing occurred without preparation. Storm reveals the architecture behind your transformation and dismantles the lie that your hardships were meaningless. Every hardship shaped your identity even when you resented it. Every betrayal sharpened discernment even when it hurt. Every isolation strengthened your spirit even when it felt unbearable. Every delay cultivated patience and trust, even when you questioned timing. Nothing you endured was wasted. The nights you cried built emotional endurance. The seasons you felt unseen built self-validation. The moments you were misunderstood built self-awareness. The times you were underestimated built quiet determination. You're becoming who God saw when He formed you, not through comfort, but through refinement. The storms were not detours. They were construction sites. Each trial removed illusion. Each setback strengthened foundation. Each disappointment clarified direction. You did not survive darkness just to remain small. You survived it to develop depth. You did not endure confusion just to remain uncertain. You endured it to value clarity. You did not walk through isolation just to feel alone. You walked through it to learn how to stand without constant support. Your emerging unfolding rising into fullness not because life became easy, but because you became resilient. You look back and realize that the very things you once prayed to escape were shaping you for what you're now ready to carry. The heartbreak prepared your compassion. The rejection prepared your independence. The silence prepared your discernment. The delay prepared your patience. Nothing was random. Everything was rehearsal. And now, as you stand in this becoming season, you see the threads connecting your past to your present. The identity you're stepping into is not accidental. It is assembled from every lesson, every wound, every breakthrough. You're not late. You're layered. You're not broken. You're built. You're not lost. You're led. And as you continue forward, remember this deeply. You're not chasing your destiny. You're unfolding into it. You're not inventing yourself. You're remembering yourself. You're not striving for elevation. You're embodying it. The storms did not weaken you. They refined you. The waiting did not delay you. It developed you. The separation did not isolate you. It positioned you. You're stepping fully into the version of yourself that heaven always knew you would become. Not by force, not by performance, but by faithfulness. And as you rise into this fullness, everything around you will begin aligning with the clarity you now carry within. The becoming season is not a distant promise waiting somewhere in the future. It is the quiet convergence happening now between who you were and who you were always meant to be. Your outer world will soon reflect your inner shift because reality responds to identity, not desperation. The internal alignment you have cultivated, the clarity you have stabilized, the discernment you have sharpened, these are not invisible efforts. They are foundations, and foundations inevitably support visible structures. Relationships will realign not through force, but through resonance. Some will deepen with new honesty and mutual elevation. Others will gently dissolve without chaos because misalignment can no longer sustain itself in your field. Opportunities will begin to mirror your maturity. You'll notice invitations that match your current capacity rather than your past limitations. Environments will shift to reflect your self-perception. You will find yourself drawn to spaces that nourish rather than deplete, conversations that expand rather than exhaust, commitments that align rather than confine. Doors will open as your identity stabilizes because doors respond to readiness more than desire. When your self-concept evolves, access follows. When your internal posture strengthens, permission is no longer required. You're stepping into your divine emergence season, not as someone trying to prove transformation, but as someone embodying it. Emergence does not shout, it radiates. It does not demand attention, it attracts alignment. This is why boldness now feels different. It is not reckless, it is rooted. Walk boldly not because you're fearless, but because you're anchored. Walk intentionally not because everything is certain, but because your spirit is aligned. Walk without fear, not because uncertainty disappears, but because trust outweighs doubt. Your future self is no longer distant. You're becoming them now with every decision made from clarity rather than insecurity, with every boundary set from conviction rather than guilt, with every opportunity embraced from readiness rather than desperation. The gap between who you imagined and who you are is narrowing because imagination is turning into embodiment. You're not chasing your next level, you're stabilizing into it. You're not waiting for confirmation, you're living as confirmation. The becoming season is not about dramatic external change overnight. It is about consistent internal alignment that inevitably produces external reflection. Stay grounded, stay present. Stay aware of how far you have already come, because the version of you that once prayed for clarity, strength, and direction would recognize this moment as answered prayer. You're not starting over, you're stepping forward, and everything around you is about to catch up with who you have already become.